I have a friend with whom I text back and forth on most days. We chat about our jobs, church life, personal events, but at least once a week, her message will read, "Got a minute?" It's the signal that she wants to actually talk by phone rather than text. And her usual conversation topic is complaining about something that isn't going well. "Can you believe the internet is out again?" she'll say. "How am I supposed to get my work done when I can't get online? I have a 1 o'clock deadline to meet." She always takes a few minutes to vent her frustration, and I know to just let her rant a little. Then, having shared her feelings, she shifts into troubleshooting mode. "I guess I can pack up and head to a coffee shop for a while. Panera usually has good internet. Do you want to meet me there later for lunch?" Complaining or grumbling tends to get a bad rap in a lot of circles. When children do it, we often tell them to stop whining. Adults who complain get labeled as Debbie Downers or viewed as difficult to handle. They may even be chastised for their bad attitude. Society values happy, sunshiny, go-getter types, not complainers. So perhaps it is no surprise that Moses is annoyed with the Israelites when they begin to complain. He thinks of all he has risked and sacrificed to bring these people out of slavery in Egypt, and now they dare to gripe about being a little hungry? He's also offended by their ungrateful behavior. He and Aaron are these people's divinely appointed leaders. Why don't they understand? They're doing the best they can. How dare the people say anything negative about them? In our rush to acknowledge and affirm Moses' indignation, we may overlook one very important detail. The Israelites actually have a legitimate complaint. They have left Egypt with little more than the clothes on their backs. They do not have food provisions for a long trek across the wilderness. They are quite literally in a food desert. Without a plan for obtaining groceries, they will starve to death. They would rather be slaves and alive than free and dying from hunger. Who among us would not complain at least a little bit in such a dire situation? Who among us would not cry out to those in charge, expecting them to do something? It is reasonable and even good to point out problems that need fixing. Someone needs to describe what's wrong and try to motivate those in power to address the issue. The psalmists recognize the importance of complaints. A third of the book, 50 out of 150 psalms, are what we call laments. They're a form of prayer that contains both a complaint and an appeal to God to do something. For example, in Psalm 74, the psalmist complains about Israel's foes, who have smashed up one place of worship and want to burn down others. He asks, "Oh God, why do you cast us off forever?" And then continues, "Do not let the downtrodden be put to shame." Another psalmist writes in Psalm 55, "Give ear to my prayer, O God. I am troubled by my complaint, for the wicked bring trouble upon me." And in Psalm 22, we find the poignant words of Jesus' own complaint as he hung on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?" Followed by the plea, "Come quickly to my aid." So when the Israelites realize that there is no food to prepare for dinner, they cry out. Just as in the laments written by the psalmist, they expect God, or at least God's emissaries, to do something. And God does not disappoint them. 4 times in the reading that we heard, the story affirms that God has heard the Israelites' complaint. The last affirmation even comes directly from God. "I have heard the complaining." And then the Holy One lays out a divine plan to feed these refugees. Bread in the morning, poultry at night. It's not a particularly diverse menu, but it is enough to fill their bellies and sustain them on their way to the promised land. Their complaint, at least the first one, has been successfully resolved. The vineyard workers of Jesus' parable are not so lucky. They too have a complaint, which they present to the landowner. They believe that everyone should receive the same hourly wage for the same kind of work. On the surface, their demand sounds reasonable. Equal pay for equal work is a value that I think many in this room would endorse. We don't want anyone to receive less pay for the same amount of labor. But the vineyard workers' grumbling really isn't about receiving a fair wage. What they object to is the landowner's generosity toward others. The laborers who began their day's work first thing in the morning received the daily wage promised when they were hired. Their complaint is born of resentment and greed rather than a real threat to their or others' well-being. I must say, though, I sympathize with the day laborers. By usual business standards, they do have a point. Hourly workers don't typically receive a wage for time that they aren't on the job. But labor unions and other social justice movements regularly argue for worker benefits that include paid time off for illness, vacation, and family emergencies. Professional workers rely on such perks to juggle their work and family lives effectively. The goal should be more paid time off for everyone, not a careful and punitive accounting of just who was fortunate enough to get hired first and who wasn't that lucky. The people in the vineyard story who really have a reason to complain are the ones who didn't get hired until just before quitting time. They've spent all day standing in the marketplace, hoping they will get enough work to pay their bills and feed their families. Like many of the folks who hang out at Lowe's and Home Depot looking for odd jobs, they need cash badly. They do the work of waiting in the hope of getting more lucrative work at some point. Perhaps this is why Jesus hears the complaint of those who worked in the vineyard from sunup to sundown, but refuses to do what they ask. Unlike the Israelites, whose concern is life-threatening, the issue raised by the disgruntled day laborers threatens others' lives. It suggests that those who have been working should be given more to prove that they are more highly valued. It suggests their efforts count for more than the persistence of those who must hustle all day long to eventually make a few bucks when they're finally picked. It's as if those first chosen want to declare, "Don't treat me like those other guys. They're nothing like me. They deserve less than me." Now, most days, I don't really have much to complain about. I have shelter, food, companionship, meaningful work, and most days even time for rest and recreation. Yet I find myself tempted to complain anyway. I grumble about running out of frozen bagels for breakfast. I commiserate with coworkers about slow internet speeds and useless meetings. I'm annoyed that our elderly cat pooped outside the litter box again. I even huff at my husband when he forgets until the last minute to tell me that he's scheduled his car for service and he needs me to follow him to the dealership and then take him to work. And I thought I was getting into my office early. I sometimes let these petty annoyances grow until I lose sight of what is really worth complaining about. Things like racism, sexism, and homophobia. Broken social systems that leave people without a place to call home. Political and economic decisions that deprive children of a good education. Global policies and practices that accelerate climate change. These are the injustices that we need to lament. These are the challenges that we need to call to God's attention. These are problems that are too big for us to solve on our own. We need divine inspiration and spirit-fueled guides and energy to help us. We need holy compassion and care to carry and sustain us. We need God to provide spiritual food and a generous amount of tangible support to keep us going when the going gets tough. But sometimes we doubt that God knows or cares what happens to us. We feel like those Israelites in the wilderness who are sure that God has forsaken them just days after God liberated them from slavery. We feel like the vineyard workers who are convinced that God is trying to cheat them out of what is rightfully theirs. Caught up in our day-to-day challenges, we fear we won't survive, let alone thrive. Our lives become a series of complaints, tossed in all directions in the hope that someone might hear and intervene. What do you complain about? What gets under your skin or makes your blood boil? What worries you enough that you would ask God to fix it? What is your lament? No matter what the issue, God hears your complaining. God hears your mumbling about how life isn't fair and you want special treatment. God hears your quiet desperation as you struggle to make ends meet. God hears your insistence that something has to change or you just won't survive. God hears, and God will respond. When the psalmists lament, they include more than just their complaints and a request for God's help. They also remember ways that God has been there for God's people in the past. Even when things seem bleak, they remember how God swept away Pharaoh's army in the Red Sea so that the Israelites could escape. They recall how God provided manna and quail for 40 years in the wilderness. They retell stories of victory in battle when God was by their side. They remember the fulfillment of promises to Abraham, Noah, and Jacob, even when much time elapsed before all was well. And perhaps most surprisingly, the psalmists give thanks as well for the assistance they feel sure that God will provide in the future. They anticipate God's deliverance from evil, just as Jesus taught his disciples to do. They risk trusting that God will be with them in the worst of times and will eventually bring a new earth where justice will roll down like water. They adopt the stance of an eternal optimist who believes in hope and possibilities despite evidence to the contrary. So the challenge we face is not to put on a happy face and stop complaining. It is to focus our laments on those things that undercut human flourishing and embrace God's promise to respond in life-giving ways to life-threatening situations. We have to learn to complain about the things that really matter and not sweat the smaller stuff. We need to apply the see something, say something public safety model to systemic practices of discrimination, as well as to suspected terrorist activity. We need to explicitly ask God to change hearts and minds so that public policies are equitable and just. We need to remember that God has experience overthrowing bullies, dictators, and authoritarian figures. We need to claim the promise of a world where people live in genuine harmony, no matter how distant the realization of that promise seems. With that in mind, I have another parable for you. So hear the good news. The kingdom of heaven is like a small UCC church trying to live faithfully on Richmond's south side. They are righteous complainers, calling out the needs and injustices in their community. They do what they can, but the laborers are few, and they sometimes worry about surviving. But they remember how God has stood with them. They found the means to install solar panels to reduce their carbon footprint. They supported one another and their neighbors during a global pandemic. They have continued their social outreach ministries through several pastoral transitions. They believe God will find new ways to use them in the future and are thankful for God's faithfulness. This little band of disciples laments all that is wrong and trusts in God's ability to right it. And to them, God gives the bread of life, sustaining them in the wilderness. God generously blesses them with the abilities they need to make a difference. Others may look at them and grumble, they can't do much, we should get their blessings. We're bigger, we have more workers, God should give us more and give them less. But God chooses to stand with them, equipping them for great things. They may look like they should be last in line, but God has called them forward. Thanks be to God. As we prepare to go, we do so knowing that we share the peace of Christ. The peace of Christ be with you all. May the love of God assure you, the hope of God guide you, and the peace of God sustain you as you go forth, receiving and extending God's grace in the world. God's blessings be upon you, now and forever. Amen.